Today's daf is daf Dalid, and we'll start from the top of the daf. And we start with a response to a question on the bottom of the previous Amud that was raised by Rav Hoshaya. And Rav Hoshaya was wondering back and forth about the understanding of the Shita Rab Shimon. And here he says, Mali Omer Rab Shimon. And he bases his question on the fact that Rabbi Shimon had ruled that if the mincha was prepared as a minchas machvas in a vessel that's called a machvas, and the Kohen at the time of the kmitza, which is the most important part of the avoda, he declared that this is a minchas marcheshes, and that's a machshav of shalol lishma, which normally would passel the carbon, and the bailam would have to bring a replacement. In this case, Rabbi Shimon paskins that the carbon is ola l'bailam l'shem chol, meaning it's a perfectly valid carbon, and we don't pay any attention to the shalol lishma of the Kohen. So the Gemara now vacillates. How do we understand this principle of Rabbi Shimon? Taima de Rabbi Shimon mishum machshava de minkre lo posla, v'ha machshava de minkre hi. Is Reb Shimon based on the fact, as Rabbah had taught us back on Daf Gimel, that the statement of the Kohen at the time of the Kmitza is sheker. It's total falsehood because the carbon is being brought in a machvas. And if it's being brought and prepared in a machvas, then clearly it's a minchas machvas. It's not a minchas marcheshes. And it's obvious to the spectator who stands on the sidelines and hears the declaration of the Kohen that the Kohen is saying nothing. And therefore the machshava shalol lishma doesn't register and the carbon is kosher. O Dilma, or perhaps we have a different explanation for Rabbi Shimon. Time of the Rabbi Shimon mishum dichsiv v'zos toras hamincha. The Torah equates all menachos in the word Toras. In other words, the exegesis here is that the word Toras is added by the Torah to teach you that Torah achas lekulam, that all the menachos are really combined and integrated to form one identical whole, and therefore this is not shalol lishma. The minchas marcheshes is not to be considered as a different, fundamentally different carbon than a minchas machvas, but rather we consider them both to be part of the same. And in the parallel case in Zvachim, in a case where, let's say, for example, a person brings a carbon ola, and the Kohen declares at the time of the shchita or the zrika that this is a carbon shlamim, in that case, v'zevach lo ksiv. The word v'toras does not appear with regard to Zvachim, as it does with regard to Menachos, and therefore in Zvachim, every single carbon is a separate identity, and therefore there's a psul of shalol lishma. But again, as we emphasize now in the second possibility in interpreting Reb Shimon, who validates the carbon, it's because of the Torah achas yeh lechem, that the Torah added the word Torah in order to indicate that all menachos are part of one entity. Amaleh, Rav Asi was the one who received this question from Rav Oshi, and he sort of responded with a surprise response, and he says, "Klum higanu l'sof daitel shel Reb Shimon." You're asking questions about Reb Shimon, and you're trying to analyze what is the underlying logic of Reb Shimon for his ruling. And I don't understand why you're bothering asking such a question about Reb Shimon when Reb Shimon himself contradicted himself. In one brisa, Reb Shimon is recorded as saying that the mincha is ola l'baylam l'shem chova. In another brisa, Reb Shimon contradicts himself and says that it's not ola l'baylam l'shem chova. So you know what? Before you ask questions about what underlies the sheet of Reb Shimon, first explain to me the sheet of Reb Shimon and figure out how to reconcile these two brisos that have contradictory recordings of the sheet of Reb Shimon. Now, the Gemara wants to know the following. Okay, there is a contradiction, and that certainly bothers the mind of Rav Asi. One Brisa records Reb Shimon as saying that the carbon is kosher, the mincha is kshera, and the other that the mincha is psula. But we already worked overtime and offered three different answers, three different approaches, as we did on Daf Gimel, to reconcile these two. For example, Ki Rabba, we had Rabba's reconciliation, and according to the Shita of Rabba, we didn't have a problem in answering the stira between the two brisos because they were talking about two different cases. So the Gemara says, you know what? Rav Asi was not interested in the reconciliation of Rabbah because, you know what, there were objections to Rabbah. Kusha d'Abaye, Mishum Kusha d'Abaye. Abaye had asked the question that if Rabbah is correct, that there's a fundamental difference between what's called Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Bailim, Abaye said they're all the same. It's all Shalol Lishma. What right and what logical justification do you have, as Abaye presented it, as the original Rabbah presented it, to differentiate between these two categories? So that's why Abaye rejected Rabbah, and therefore, following suit, Rav Asi rejected Rabbah. Kidder Rav lo Mashani la. We understand also why Rav Asi didn't want to give the reconciliation that was offered by Rava, Mishum Kushav Vizos Toras Achatos. Because in fact, even with regard to Chatos, we find the word Toros. So if you're using the word Toros with regard to Menachos, to teach me that Torah Achas Lekulam, why not apply the same principle and be consistent that it says Torah's Chatos and all the Chatos should be considered as one? And therefore, let's say, for example, a person brings a Chatos for the sake of Achilas Dam, and the Kohen declares that this Chatos is being brought for the sake of atonement for Achilas Chelev, then logically, Rav Shimon, according to Rava's interpretation, should have been Machshir the Karma. And we know that Shalol Lishma and Chatas passes the Karma. Then we had a third explanation of Kirav Ashi. Why didn't Rav Asi accept the reconciliation of Rav Asi? Lo Mashani la Mishum Kusha de Rav Acha Berei de Rava. We had an objection to the presentation of Rav Ashi, and that rejection was raised by Rav Acha, and that is that if you're differentiating between two categories of menachos, like for example, what about the case of someone who took upon himself to bring what's called a mincha yevesha? A mincha yevesha is a kind of mincha that has no addition of shemen, like for example, a minchas chote, and the Kohen made a declaration at the time of the Kmitza that he's bringing this mincha for a wet mincha, meaning not a dry mincha, but a blula. Blula means it's mixed with shemen. So therefore, the objection of Rav Acha Brei de Rava was a very potent objection. And he was basically saying that if you're going to apply the principle according to Rav Shimon of Torah Achas, and not only that, you want to apply the principle of the way it was interpreted by Rav Ashi, and that means that, you know, according to Rav Ashi, Rav Shimon would be machshir a mincha that was brought as a yevesha, even though the Kohen declares it as a retuva, meaning as one that has lug shemen, and yet Reb Shimon didn't go that far. So basically, to sum, this sugya that we just learned now is a completion of yesterday's daf, in which we find that Rav Asi rejected all three reconciliations of the two brises of Reb Shimon, and were left stuck out in the cold without any explanation for Reb Shimon. And therefore, when Rav Oshia started asking, does Reb Shimon mean this? Is his principle based on that? Forget about that, says Rav Asi. First, you tell me, how to reconcile the stira between the two brises. I'm not going to accept any of the three-pronged attempt to reconcile these two brises. Now we go to the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, this begins today's sugya, Chutz mi minchas chote u minchas knos. There are two kinds of menachos, which even Reb Shimon agrees that shalol lishma will passel the mincha. And they are a minchas chote and a minchas sota. So the Gemara says to find Bishleim and Minchas Chote, I understand very well why Reb Shimon would have to concede that Shalol Lishma will passel in a Minchas Chote. And that's because Chatos Kari Rachmana. The Torah describes this carbon of Minchas Chote as a carbon Chatos. And we know that in Zvachim, as we learned in the first Mishnah in Masechtes Zvachim, that in a case of a chatos, if there was a shalol lishma, for example, the Kohen declared about this chatos that it's l'shem ola, then the chatos is completely disqualified. You have to throw it into the beis hapsul and burn it with psulei hamukdashim. And the same thing is going to apply to a minchas chote, which is a carbon chatos. The Torah goes out of its way and calls the minchas chote a chatos. So all the laws of chatos apply to this mincha. But right? Lo yosim oleh Hashem v'lo yitin oleh levona ki chatos. When the Torah says that in a minchas chota you don't add any shemen, any oil, it's what's called a mincha yevesha, then the Torah adds the word chatosi. Ela minchas knos minolan. But in the case of a man who suspected his wife, and she has to drink from the mei merorim, and she has to bring a carbon mincha, there the Torah doesn't call it a chatos. So how do you know that in the case of minchas knos, right, the mincha of jealousy, that mincha, if it was brought shalol lishma, it's possible? Why do you say such a thing? Where does it say chatos in the context of a minchas knos? And the Gemara answers the Tani Tana Kameder of Nachman, and now we're going to enter into the laws of Gzeira Shava. Gzeira Shava, just to sum, is when you have a word in one parsha, we call it parsha X, and you find the same word in parsha Y, you derive an equation and an analogy from these two parshios, and the dinim are the same. And where do we have an equation between minchas knos and a karban chatos? Well, guess what? We have it with regard to Moseres Nidava. Mosra Nidava. Now, let's understand what the word Mosra means, and let's understand what the word Nidava means. Mosra means one of two things. Either she designated the carbon, which is made, let's say, of barley, and she estimated that the market price for barley is 100. Well, guess what? The market price for barley went down. And now she's left with a surplus. It's on the market now at 90. She has a surplus of 10. So the halacha is that 10 goes into the Trumas HaLishka. Right? Excuse me. In the Beis HaMikdash, they had various kupos in which they put money that was dedicated to buy Kates HaMizbeach, which is called a carbon nedava. A nedava means that if the Mizbeach was sitting idly and there were no carbonas being brought on any particular day, then they went into the Trumas HaLishka, they took the money out of these kupos, and they used it to buy a nedava satzibur, a carbon ola, that was a voluntary carbon ola. Then you could have another case of Mosra, if, let's say, for example, she designated a certain animal for that carbon mincha, a certain flour, and then she replaced it with other flour, and then she found the original flour, which she thought was lost. In this case, we have extra surplus that goes into the various kupos and is designated for an nedava. Again, nedava means a voluntary carbon atzibu. Now, in fact, in the Beis HaMikdash, they were all told 13 kupos, and each kupa had a purpose for a collection of funds, but 6 out of the 13 were for Mosra, were for these residual or, shall we say, overflow monies that would be designated for a carbon adava, an ola. Amalei. So what do we have here in this brisa? Shapir Kalmat. This brisa is teaching me something that makes a lot of sense. Why? Because the Torah says in the parsha Minchas Knos, Mazkeres Avon Ksivbe. Emphasize the word Avon, sin. Now let's jump to the parsha of Chatos, and there again we're going to see the word Avon. Ubechatos Ksiv v'osa nosan lochem laseis es Avon ha'eda. So we see again the word Avon. That gives us a Gzeres Shava, and from that Gzeres Shava we're going to learn, number one, that Ma Chatos Mosra Nedava, just like in Chatos, any residual money, if let's say he's designated another animal because he lost the first animal, now he found the first animal, what does he do with the second animal, etc., etc., all that goes to the 6 kupos that we spoke about before. And that halacha that in Chatos Mosra goes l'nedava is derived in a sugya in Tmura from the pasuk Kesef Hashem v'Kesef Chatos lo yuva beis Hashem lakonim yu, etc., etc. And therefore, af minchas knos mosar nedava. Since in the case of minchas kanos, it also uses the word avon, the same 3 words with the same vocalization avon. We set up a gzeres shava, and that gzeres shava will teach me that mosra linedava. And that principle now applies not just to chatos, but by virtue of the gzeres shava, it's going to apply to the case of minchas knos as well. And now we're going to take this gzeres shava one step forward. Ukechatos, and again, we have a principle called ein gzeres shava lemechza. Whenever we have a gzeres shava, we equate A to B completely, and therefore ma chatos psula shelo lishma af minchas knos psula shelo lishma. Once the Torah has described the minchas knos as avon, then by virtue of the Gzeres Shava and the analogy to Chatos, just like Chatos Shelo Lishma apostles the Karman, if the Kohen said that this Chatos is L'Shem Ola, so too in the case of Minchas Knos, if let's say the Kohen at the time of the Kmitza would declare that this Mincha is for Machvas, Marcheshes, Yevesha, whatever it might be, then it's going to apostle the Karman. And therefore, even though Rabbi Shimon normally would look for a way, based on the 3 different interpretations of Rav Shimon, that you would be machshir the mincha, but here, this minchas knos is upgraded, so to speak, to the status of a chatos, and therefore shelo lishma apostles the carbon. Elameata osham yehi posel shelo lishma. We know that a chatas and also Korban Pesach is posel shelo lishma, but we never heard that an asham is posel shelo lishma, and yet in asham gomar avon michatos. In the parsha of asham, we likewise find the word avon, but that's not exactly true. We don't find the word avon in asham, but we have the word lo yadav Hashem v'nosa avono. So again, avon is 3 letters, ayin, vav, nun. Avono is 4 letters. But the Gemara at this point thinks that in the laws that govern a Gzeres Shava, the difference in one letter, which is only a conjugation, it's not in the shorish, in the real root of the word, doesn't have to bother us. And therefore, we should now suck in asham to this category, to this group of karbanos, like the chatos, which shelo lishma is passes. And yet shelo lishma and asham does not pass the karban. And the Gemara says, done in avon mi avon, ve'ein done in avon, avono min avon. Right, the extra vav is going to upset the apple cart, and we can no longer get this gzeres shava. So Gemara says, that's not so. In the laws of gzeres shava, we don't have to look for every single letter of the word. Meinaf Gemina, there's no difference between Avon and Avono. Why? The Tani, the Bei Rabbi Shmuel, a very famous brisa that's often quoted in Shas, to prove the flexibility and the inclusiveness, if you will, of a Gzeres Shava. V'shav HaKohen Uba Kohen. Again, this has to do with Tumas Nige Batim. And the law is that the Kohen has to go out and check the bias and see if he can determine whether the bias has a nega, and that nega fulfills all the requirements of a nega, and that is in the process of the Kohen declaring the bias as being Tomei. And by the way, Tumas Negoim in Batim generates what's called Netitzo. We have to destroy the house. But then there's Uba Kohen, that the Kohen at the end of the period of Negoim, after he's determined that this is a suspicious nega on the bias, he comes back to check it again. And according to the Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel, we have a Gzera Shava here from Vishav HaKohen to Uba HaKohen, and Zui Shiva, Zuhi Bia, meaning all the laws that apply to Bia apply to Shiva. And now these are different stages in which the Kohen inspects the bias to look at the nega, and yet we're going to say that even though in one context of HaKohen it says Vishav, in the other context it says Uba, and yet that doesn't bother us. And Rabbi Shmuel says that's still a valid Gzera Shava, and it links the two of Shiva and Bia, so the same halachos apply in both cases. So why are you bothered by Avon and Avono? I mean, the radical difference between Vishav and Uba is that much greater than the difference between Avon and Avono. Vion, and furthermore, Ligmar Avono. Not only that, but I'm going to show you that even from the word Avono, with the extra Vav, you can derive a Gzera Shava. And why is that? Because in the parsha of what's called Vishama Kol Allah, which means that if, let's say, Ruvain demands testimony in a monetary case in the courts from Shimon, Shimon denies that he has any testimony. Ruvain then is mashbiah Shimon, he imposed upon him a shvuah. And then later on, we find out that Shimon, in fact, when he took that shvuah, he violated the oath because it was a false oath, because he really did have testimony. And the Torah says he's got to bring a carbon, what's called a carbon asham. And what does it say over there? It says over there, it says, Me'avon d'shmias kol, dichsiv im lo yagiv v'nosa avono. So now we have something called a carbon asham of Vishama Kol Allah. And what does it say in that pasuk? It says V'nosa Avono. So what was your argument? Your argument was that we cannot establish a Gzera Shava here because in the parsha of Asham it says Avono. Okay, but what about this case here of Vishama Kol Allah? There also it says Avono, and again we're talking about witnesses that took this oath, but they do have, in fact, testimony. And when the Bezdin will determine that this fellow, who we called him Shimon, who actually lied under oath and he has testimony to give on behalf of Reuven, when we find that out, the law is that he has to bring a carbon chatas. So we see that even in the context of chatas, it says avono with the extra vav. Ella, says the Gemara, ki gemiri gzera shava lemosa nedavo gemiri. Ay v'chi tema ein gzera shava lemechza. Goli rachmana gabi chatas v'shachat osol chatas osol lishma kshera and shalol lishma psula. Aval kol kodshim bein lishman ubein shalol lishman ksherin. Gemara says you're right. Ein gzera shava lemechza. Once we have a gzera shava between chatos and asham, because in both cases it says avon or avono, we should therefore determine that if there was a shalol lishma, it's possible. Why do you use the Gzera Shava only for the halacha of Mosrol and Adava? Use it straight across the board, even for the halacha of shalol lishma, possible. No. Says the Gemara, there's an extra word in the parsha of chatos, which is a miut that excludes any other karma. Why? Because it says in the parsha of chatos osa, it, to the exclusion of any other carbon. So therefore, in any other carbon, like for example in Asham, if the Kohen makes a declaration at the time of the Shechita, the Zrika, etc., that this carbon is for Ola, it's for Chatos, for whatever it is, then it's kosher. And why is it kosher? Because the din of Shalol Lishma Pasul in Chatos is limited to Chatos because of the word Osa. So the Gemara now asks the following. If this be the case, Ela minchas chote u minchas nedava, knos, de poslo shalosh mavinah. We're back to square one. We're back to the drawing board. Right? You wanted to say that in these cases of minchas knos, etc., the din is shalosh ma because we have an equation to chatos. We've just finished saying that there's a miut in the parsha of chatos osa, and no other carbon. And the other carbon, all kachim, is bein lishma, bein shalol lishma kosher. So now we have to find a substitute, a new source from which we derive the conclusion that minchas knos shalol lishma is possible. So Gemara answers, we're going to use a svara, a logic. Chatos taimamai. What's the logic in the case of chatos? That shalol lishma is possible because of the very essence of the carbon. The carbon is to atone for a sin. And Mishum Ksivba, who? The Torah says this is the carbon. It's the carbon chatos to atone for a sin. Hani nami. Let's take a look in other carbonos. Let's say, for example, in the mincha of a chote, and in the minchas knos of a woman who's suspect, etc., haksiv bahu hu. The word who appears as well. It says in the parsha of minchas chote, ki chatos hu. And in the parsha of minchas knos, it says ki minchas knos hu. So the Gemara says, okay, so you're building on the fact that it's who, it's got to be that one, and therefore Shalol Lishma is possible. Well, guess what? Asham Nami Haksiv Bahu Hu. In the Parsha of Asham, it says, Vehiktir Osam HaKohen HaMizbecha Ishal Hashem Asham Hu, meaning it's got to be a, shall we say, an atonement for that which generates a carbon asham, right? There are 5 different categories of averos that generate a carbon asham. So Gemara says, you know what? That word hahu in the parsha of Asham cannot be relevant to us at all. Because if you're going to derive from hahu in the parsha of Asham that the carbon is possible because of lishma, that machsheva shalol lishma is during one of the 4 avodos. But the word hu appears after li'achar haktaras imurim hu dichsiv. Now, haktaras imurim after the 4 avodos, culminating with zrika, is not ma'akiv in the carbon. If there was no haktaras imurim, the carbon is still kosher. So you can't derive a halacha of psul, namely shalol lishma, from the word who, when the word who, in its context, is referring to li'achar haktoras ha'imurim. Kirisanya, as we saw in the Brisa, aval Hashem lo nemer bo hu el li'achar haktoras ha'imurim, hu atzva shelo k'tiru emurim kosher. If he didn't even burn the emurim at all, he just completely omitted it, the carbon is still kosher, because the carbon is clinched once there was rika, and therefore what happens afterwards, namely to fulfill the mitzvah aktaras emurim, that's not likuv, that's not critical for the carbon. And then you're going to derive that a shalol lishma apostles the carbon's already kosher. So that hahu is out. No, v'elahu lamali. So now we can ask a side question here. This is not a fundamental question, but on the side, now that you've told me that who is li'achar haktaras ha'imurim and it can't teach us anything about lishma, so why did the Torah add the word who in the parsha of Asham? Lichar Rav Huna Amar Asham shenitak l're'iyah kosher l'shum olah. Nitak in lo nitak lo. Okay, now, when I get to Gemaras like this, I sort of have to take a deep breath. We're really going into the wild blue yonder of Kodshim here. You got to be really fatifed in Kodshim, to appreciate this. Anyway, there's a halacha called Re'iyah. And Re'iyah means that even though you have carbon X, whatever that might be, it can possibly become a carbon Ola. How is that so? How does a carbon magically transform its image from that of Chata Shlomim, whatever it might be, and all of a sudden it becomes an Ola? So that has to do with the halacha of Re'iyah. Now, the word Re'iyah comes from the word Roeh, which means a shepherd. The shepherd here is playing a secondary role, and what he's doing is he is causing a mum in the animal. Now we have a behemoth kodshim. Why in heaven's tarnation are we giving this? That's called nitak, is when we designate it for the shepherd. So that the shepherd will take this animal out in the grazing area until it swallows a nail and gets an injury to its lungs, and therefore it's possible. It's a balmum. Why are we doing that? I mean, it's a behemoth kodshim. And the answer is because this animal, if it would have been a chatos, for example, would be left to die. And why is that? Because there are 5 categories of chatos that we derive from halacha l'Moshe Sinai that have to be left to die. One of them is mesu ba'olav. What does mesu ba'olav mean? Ruvain consecrates a carbon, right? He takes upon himself a pledge to bring a carbon, and he designates an animal as a carbon. And then, unfortunately, before they got a chance to bring the carbon on the Mizbeach, Reuven dies. So this animal is now a behemoth kodshim, but mesu ba'oleh. There's no purpose and no significance to the animal. It cannot be brought as a carbon because the bailam has died. If it would have been a chatos, we have to put it to death. But if it's not a chatos, if it's any other carbon, then what do we do with this carbon after the owner of the carbon dies? Well, we don't let the animal die. We send it out to a roeh until it becomes a balmum. And that's called nitak l're'iyah. Now, once it becomes a balmum, we can sell it on the market, and the monies will now be dedicated to buy a carbon ola. So in a sense, this carbon already takes upon itself the identity of being a carbon ola, because this is the ultimate goal, to make this animal, after we sell it when it becomes a balas mum, into a carbon ola. So it's sort of, the animal embodies the future carbon ola, because its value on the market will be such that we take those funds and we invest them in a carbon ola. So asham shenitak l're'iyah, like let's say, for example, a man, let's say, took that shvua that we mentioned before, or he was moel behegdesh, he's chayiv a carbon asham, which is called asham me'ilos, and then he dies after the carbon was designated. So now we give the animal over to the roeh, and it will graze and so forth. So this whole story that we mentioned before, and kosher l'shum ola. And now this carbon, which couldn't be brought as an asham because the bailim died, it will now be brought as an ola. Now, what does that mean? It's brought as an ola. It's destined to be an ola, and therefore, right, because we want, after the shepherd does whatever he does, therefore we already want to give the status of the animal the status of a carbon ola. So again, it started as a carbon asham, and now became magically an ola. So the Gemara now is medayik. It only becomes an ola because it was nitak, because the supervisors of kodshim, in the mizbeach, in the Beis Hamikdash, they already sent it off, or designated at least to be sent off with the roh. But lo nitak, if it didn't get to that point of nitak, and they hadn't yet designated it for the roer, then it cannot become an ola. And where do we know that from? I mean, it's just a matter of waiting a few seconds until they do the nituk. Why can't it be an ol already now? And the answer is Omakra, hu bava yoso heye. So we have this extra word hu in the Pasha of Asham to tell us that as long as there wasn't that stage of nitak, then it cannot be an Asham that converted itself into an ol. Okay. Now, we're up to Amar Rav. Okay. Until now, we said that in two cases of two karbanos mincha, even Reb Shimon agrees that Shalol Lishma apostles the mincha. Those were minchas knos and minchas chote. Comes along Rav and he wants to add a third category of a mincha where Shalol Lishma is going to apostle it, and that's minchas haomer. Now, as you know, the Torah says that you're not allowed to eat min chadash. You can't eat from the new grains, the 5 species of grains that have just been planted, and we wait a few months and we harvest it until after the Omer is brought on the 16th of Nisan. And that is a Minchas HaOmer, which is Matir Chadash, and it makes it into Yoshan. Now, the Kohen, at the time of the Kmitza of the Minchas HaOmer, he declares that this Mincha is going to be for some other Mincha. He calls it a Minchas Chote, he calls it a Minchas Marcheshes, whatever he calls it. Psula, says Rav. Here's a third case in which Rabbi Shimon would concede that Shalol Lishma apostles a Mincha. And why? So Rav applies the following logic. Hoil ubas lahativ lo itira. Once the Kohen, at the time of the Kmitza, declares that this is not a carbon omer, but rather this is a different kind of a mincha, the carbon is robbed of its efficacy, of its power to generate a heter for chadash and make it into yashan. It can't do so. And the whole point of bringing this minchas haomer was to be matir. That makes it what's called a carbon hamachshir. And now, Rav is going to look for other cases that fit into that same profile, namely that it is a carbon hamachshir. Now, what do I mean by carbon hamachshir? Normally, in 99 out of 100 cases, the carbon is a machaper. Its purpose is to atone for a sin. But Rav says there's a whole new category of karbanos out there in the world of Kodshim, which are not coming to atone for a sin. The Minchas Homer, for example, is not to atone for a sin. And we're going to see that a Nazir, at the termination of his Nazirus, he brings a carbon asham in order to be mater him, to allow him to drink wine, to go into a cemetery, to cut his hair. It has nothing to do with sin. On the contrary, the Nazir was on a higher level. Now he's going back to normal. He's, one of the bunch, and he has to bring a carbon asham. And therefore, if the carbon was brought as an Asham Nazir by the Nazir, and the Kohen got up and he said, Shalol Lishma, no, this carbon is for a different purpose, then again, that would passel the carbon. Why? Because Rav Shita is that if the purpose of a carbon is not to be machaper, but rather to be machshir, and it cannot be machshir, then the carbon is passel. And now we turn to Amud Beis.